Time and Infinities, starting with time. If you ask a physicist how they define time, you'll get various answers. Some will give an answer like Einstein, time is what clocks measure. Others will say that it is an extra dimension similar to space, that along with space makes up space-time. In order to be more precise, I will give my own precise definition. I define time as that which separates events and orders them in a before and after relationship. To understand this better, I will define an event of the universe as a specific state of the universe. For a smaller system, I would define an event as a specific state of that system. An example of a system is a bouncing ball, and an event of the system would be the state of the system when the ball is at the peak of its bounce, when the ball is at the floor interacting with it, and when the ball is at the midpoint between these other events. There are, of course, many states or events in between these events that we could also select to look at. To explain just what I mean by time, we will analyze the bouncing ball system. If we look at the event where the ball is at the peak of the bounce and the event where the ball is interacting with the floor, we notice that the definition of time that I gave, that which separates events and orders them into a before-after relationship, would include all the intermediate events as well as the associated entropy of those events. To get the smallest quantity of time and get a better, more precise understanding of time, we will need to isolate two consecutive events. This means that we need to adjust the events that we are looking at. Let's keep looking at the event where the ball is interacting with the floor, but instead of looking at the state where the ball is at the peak of its bounce, let's instead look at the state at which the ball stops interacting with the floor as it's bouncing up. So now we're looking at the event where the ball is interacting with the floor and the event where the ball stops interacting with the floor with upward motion. There are no longer any intermediate states or events between the states that we are looking at. Although there are no other states between these states, we are looking at there is something that exists between them. Otherwise, they would be the same state. This thing that separates the two consecutive states is precisely what I mean by time. Of course, the other component of time being that which orders events into a before-after relationship. This is still the associated entropy of the states. So now you have a better understanding of what I mean by time. In my argument for God, I will make statements like what exists before time, or before time began, or before time. Some of these seem to be contradictory or inconsistent. What is meant by before time? Usually, we use the word before to indicate a state preceding some indicated state. But if we are talking about the beginning of time, using the word before has to mean something slightly different. Otherwise, we would be suggesting that there was a moment of time before there was time. By stating before time, I am indicating that there was a beginning of time, a group of states that existed that were not separated from each other, that could not have had a beginning. These things, since they are not separated by time, could be stated to be before time, since time, as I defined it, is that which separates events and orders them into a before-after relationship. All of these states or events existed before the first moment of time, and were more accurately a single state made up of multiple states. Okay, now for infinities or infinite time. Now that you know what I mean by time and before time, we must discuss what infinite time, or time without a beginning, means. The idea of infinite time or infinite past has in it the idea that time has no beginning. Here I am not planning to directly define infinite time, but instead give a few properties of infinite time. The purpose of this is to show that infinite time is incompatible with the first premise of the argument, something must always have existed. First, let's look at the idea of infinities. If something is infinite, it must have some characteristics. The number line, for example, is infinite, and we notice that it has no beginning or end. We know that the positive number line is infinite, starting at 1 or 0 and increasing off to infinity, or having a beginning but no end. Likewise, the negative number line is also infinite, starting at -1 and decreasing to negative infinity, or it has no beginning but has an end. For something to be infinite, we thus can conclude that it requires one of the characteristics, that it either has no beginning, no end, or no beginning and no end. Usually, when people are talking about infinities, or about infinite time, they are talking about time in the past, or the past infinite time. This is much like the negative number line, in which it has no beginning but has an end in or at the present. I will also argue that a property of the infinite past is that time must have necessarily existed before everything or anything else. For if something existed before time, necessarily time had a beginning and thus could not have an infinite past. Now I would like to address the first premise of my argument for God. Something must always have existed. This argument doesn't go well with an infinite time past. For an infinite time past, remember that this requires that time must exist before anything or everything else. This would suggest that necessarily at some point in the infinite past, you would need to reach a point before which only time could exist, even if this is infinitely far in the past. Another way to look at this is to look at how time and events are ordered. There are ultimately only two ways in order to order time into a repeating pattern. Either you have an event, then a moment of time, then an event, or you have a moment of time, then an event, then a moment of time. I will call these the 1-2-1 and 2-1-2 patterns, respectively. In the 1-2-1 pattern, if you extend the pattern infinitely into the past, no matter how far you look into the past, you will always find that an event comes before a moment of time. In the case of the 2-1-2 pattern, if you extend the pattern infinitely into the past, no matter how far into the past you look, you will always find a moment of time precedes an event. Now, the difference between these patterns really only shows itself if we decide to look infinitely far into the past. Whether we find a moment of time or an event is determined by the pattern. If we look infinitely far into the past in a 1-2-1 pattern, infinite past, we will find that infinitely far in the past there is first an event, then a moment of time. But this means that an event, preceded time, and thus this isn't truly an infinite past time. If we look infinitely far into the past in a 2-1-2 pattern, in patterned infinite time in past, we will find that infinitely far in the past there is first a moment of time and then an event. This truly is an infinite past. In the 1-2-1 patterned past, we see that something always existed, but that ultimately it didn't represent an infinite time past. Whereas in the 2-1-2 patterned past, we saw that time didn't have a beginning and existed before everything or anything else. But this requires that before this moment of time, nothing could have existed. This would violate the first premise of my argument for God. Thus, arguing for an infinite time is less rational within our universe, as we already concluded from the first argument that something must have always existed.